Hello everyone, and thanks for hanging out with us for the Behind the Numbers Weekly Listen, an eMarketer podcast made possible by VTEX. This is the Friday show that reviews the most riveting media news stories of the week. I'm your host, Marcus Johnson. In today's show, what brands are doing at the Tokyo Olympics?
There could be a way that not just like the endemic advertisers, like P&G can also have more versatile messaging to reach different types of subcultures.
When will time spent on digital equal linear?
People are simply watching their favorite shows, and how they're delivered is becoming less and less important, at least to the end user.
Google's new privacy timeline.
What my takeaway was, does anybody believe Google's timelines anymore? Is this like the second or third time maybe they've pushed out the deprecation of third-party cookies?
Square buys Afterpay. Why marketers must start to think in 3 dimensions. And what happens when you don't have a plan B. All right, folks, join me for today's episode. We have 3 folks. Let's introduce them. We start with our principal analyst covering TV and video. It's Paul Verna.
Great to be here.
Hello there, sir. We're also joined by our analyst on the retail and e-commerce team. It's Blake Droesch.
Hey, everybody.
Hello, fella. And finally, we have a familiar voice if you've been a long-time listener. Ladies and gentlemen, Director of Reports Editing is Rahul Chadha.
Hi, nice to be here, guys.
There he is, the Rahul of old. If you remember right when the podcast was getting started, Rahul was with us and we've got him back on the show. So absolute pleasure to have him back, joining some familiar voices with Blake and Paul. So what do we have in store for you? We have 4 segments as always. We start with the story of the week. We're talking about the Tokyo Olympics again, more about what brands are doing this week. We then move to the game of the week where our contestants Rahul, Blake, and Paul will go head to give us the best takeaway they possibly can from each of the 4 stories. We crown a champion. We then move to Questions Answered, where we answer the questions that you've emailed into us. And finally, Dinner Party Data, which tell you all about stuff we just recently learned. We start with the story of the week. What brands are doing at the Tokyo Olympics? The Tokyo Olympics, this over $15 billion extravaganza, known as the Olympics, has been quite the mixed bag of news. On the one hand, Jason Lynch of Adweek notes that the Tokyo Olympic Games' early primetime ratings were down approximately 1/3 versus the 2016 Rio Games, as was the opening ceremony, both down. On the other hand, NBC Universal notes it surpassed Rio's $1.2 billion in ad revenue. The company also shared some data pointing to gains in attention, engagement, and impact in its early Olympics ads, like opening ceremony brand recall being up nearly 40% versus the same event in Rio. Tiffany Sue of the New York Times writes that Olympic advertisers are feeling anxious about the more than $1 billion they have spent to run ads on NBC and its Peacock streaming platform. The Hollywood Reporter notes that around half the world caught some part of the 2016 Rio Olympics on traditional TV by the time of the closing ceremony. Half of the people on the planet tuned into some portion of that. That's why Jeremy Carey, the MD of the sports marketing agency Optimum Sports, says that, quote, not being there with an audience of this size and scale for some of our blue chip advertisers is not an option, close quote. So far, Coca-Cola, P&G, and Visa have paid more than $3 billion for the ability to call themselves an Olympic sponsor. That gets you permission to use the Olympic rings and the word Olympics in your marketing. But setting aside recent controversies like doping scandals and allegations of vote buying, which have happened in previous Olympics, why do multinational brands continue to sponsor this thing? Asks Robert Clara of Adweek. So gents, we'll start there. How do you think brands have been looking at this Olympics and whether or not they should invest ad dollars in this year's event?
So I think even though the ratings were, perhaps bound to be down this year for a number of reasons, the overall cachet of the Olympics, the cultural cachet, I think still has a lot of relevancy in brand marketing. If we look at the fragmentation of sports viewership in general, a lot of the consumption, especially with younger generations, has been shifted to watching clips of different events and different games in general on social media. And I've been seeing a lot of that activity over the past, week or so happening. And a lot of the conversation, whether whether it's in the traditional news or social media, is still very hyper-focused, at least from my point of view, on the Olympics. So I'd be reluctant from a brand marketing standpoint as an advertiser who wants to be sort of attached to the aspects of the Olympics that are still very much culturally relevant to be deterred just because of the waning viewership on television, whether it's linear or digital, because I think the fragmentation, just because it is fragmented and consumed differently now in a multitude of ways, doesn't make it necessarily less relevant from a branding standpoint or from like a cultural standpoint.
Yeah, I guess we're also seeing that, I mean, it's one thing to say, less people are going to be tuning into the Olympics, and that seems to be like, it could be the case when it's all said and done. We got the total numbers in for the whole event, but we're still talking about so many people watching this that, even if a third of the population tunes in as opposed to half the world, it's still a huge audience. On top of that, as an event, it's a very positive event by and large. I mean, obviously with COVID associated with this Olympics and, 8 out of 10 people in the host country saying they didn't want the thing to be on, that wanted to be postponed or cancelled, that definitely puts a dampener on it. But by and large, a very uplifting global event. And Chris Brand, the CMO of Chipotle, was saying that they see the Olympics as a bit of a unifier at a time when the country can seem to be so divided every day. And Ishveen Anand, founder and CEO of Open Sponsorship, a site that matches athletes with corporate sponsors, agrees, saying there aren't many events that have the ability to unify the world in such a way. We are supporting our country and athletes, not the games or its politics. Paul, I guess it's kind of similar to the way we look at the Super Bowl viewership every year. It's going down, but where else are you going to get 100 million people tuning into the same thing?
Yeah, I mean, well, first, I think some of the concerns in the run-up to the Olympics from brand marketers like, Toyota not sending its CEO to the opening ceremonies and pulling TV ads from Japan, I think those, not to minimize the public health crisis that Japan is going through or to minimize the concerns that a lot of people had and still have, but for the most part, I think a lot of that has been kind of, superseded by all of the good aspects of getting all these people together to watch this event. But yeah, to your question, comparing it to the Super Bowl, the same dynamics are at play. There's an audience that is huge. In some ways, actually, it makes it more important for brands because there used to be a lot more of those types of events on television. Now they're really just the Olympics, the Super Bowl, maybe the FIFA World Cup. That's about it. There's not that much that draws so many people around the one event. So, and also the price of a 30-second ad in the Olympics is quite a bit less. I think it was $1 million, which is, compared to a Super Bowl, it's a bargain. So,
yeah,
and I was
value for money.
I was actually surprised to see how many Olympic sponsors there are. There are like 140 this year, which is a lot more than the last Olympics, where there are, I think, about 100. So, yeah, so it's a huge marketing bonanza any way you look at it, even taking into account the negative aspects this year.
And over 100 of those advertisers apparently didn't participate in the Rio Games, so a lot of new folks as well.
Yes.
Which is interesting. Yeah, you mentioned the 30-second primetime commercial, $1 million that's what buyers are estimating for the Olympics compared to, what was it, Paul, for the Super Bowl? Up to 5 now? 5.5 million?
Yeah, it's just over $5 million for 30 seconds.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And as you mentioned, Toyota, yeah, that was a big news story. So a top Olympic sponsor, as Paul said, they pulled their games-related TV ads in Japan before the game started. They didn't change their US spend, but they did, as Paul said, their president saying he's not going to go to any of the events. A big deal. Toyota is one of Japan's top companies. According to Forbes, the car giant was reportedly concerned about Japanese citizens' sentiment towards the games, which seems to be borne out in that Asahi Shinbun local newspaper survey of the 8 out of 10 people in Japan saying no thank you to the games. Toyota spent around $1 billion on an 8-year Olympics deal in 2015, which runs from 2017 to 2024, according to Ad Age. So a big moment for Toyota to say, no, we don't actually want to be part of this. Some companies, though, they're pivoting. United Airlines, a Team USA sponsor, cancelled its original ad promoting flights from the US to Tokyo. and instead is now encouraging a broader return to air travel, not saying go to the games, but saying travel where you feel comfortable when you're ready. Some advertisers not completely pulling the plug, just pivoting.
I think what's interesting to me about specifically the Toyota move is that they obviously saw the Olympics as a brand safety issue, at least domestically.
Yeah.
And I think that was really interesting because I have this year been seeing a lot more conversations around just being critical of the Olympics. You know, you have not just the pandemic that's kind of front and center in a lot of people's minds, but people are raising issues about the amount of spending that goes on with infrastructure for the Olympics. You know, what's the cost to the environment of not just that construction, but all the travel. And I think there are like more concerns that are percolating up to become parts of the conversation that marketers, I think, need to start taking mind of. Not to say that I think that they're happening yet, but I think that those conversations were really interesting for brands to think about from a brand safety perspective. Like, what is the sentiment I'm actually attaching to my company by advertising with the Olympics?
Yeah, I noticed that Allianz, the insurance company, made a documentary film about mental health and athletes and you know, some of the issues they face, which has been a big topic around these Olympic Games. So in some ways, the event, even if there are aspects of it that are maybe not as feel good or even unsavory, if a brand can figure out a way to strike the right tone around those issues, then it's a positive for them.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think also on the flip side that brands, this is an opportunity for them. I think brands are still struggling with their footing in terms of creative. Like, what kind of message am I trying to send during the Olympics or just during the pandemic in general? And the Olympics does present them an opportunity to kind of put these feel good, aspirational, inspirational types of ads out to the market in a way that, you know, there aren't very many opportunities for these days.
Let's talk through some of those for a second. So Stephen Lepetak and Brittany Kiefer of Adweek put together a list of some of the ads that those advertisers were running at the Olympics. Couple for you. Costa Coffee chain was drawing a parallel between the focus of Olympians and the dedication of its own team to making good coffee, saying there's a line that says, "Not everyone will understand your dedication, but most appreciate the result." I'm not sure. Is making coffee the same as training for the... I'm not saying it's... I mean, if
you're making a real cup of coffee, then, but Marcus drinks instant coffee. So
why would I bring that up?
You know,
why would I say that?
That's like Little League, basically.
Exactly. That's sort of like taking a shortcut to training, which is a recipe for just getting completely knocked out of the game. So, yeah, it all depends on the coffee.
Cut that, Victoria. We're not using the coffee example. Not after what just happened. Michelob Ultra, they had an ad with Usain Bolt pointing runners, just casual everyday joggers, towards a bar with his signature pose where he points towards something with the tagline "Bolt to the bar." Facebook, as skateboarding makes its Olympic debut this year, more brands are spotlighting the sport. Facebook's ad tells the story of how two folks used the social media platform to build a skateboarding culture in Ghana. And Procter & Gamble, P&G, this one, if you guys haven't seen it, it was like legitimately got me quite emotional, actually very emotional. Longtime Olympic sponsor P&G, they paid tribute to the mothers from various cultures who share one thing in common, teaching their children the qualities they need to embody great athletes. So there were some pretty good ones, particularly that P&G one. It was, it pulled at the heartstrings.
I do think too, like, just to go back on that events, there are a lot of new sports that were Olympic sports for the first time this year. And like, particularly something like skateboarding that has its own subculture that's attached to it. Seeing like a lot of companies like Vans, for instance, like make a bigger deal out of the Olympics than they previously would have is unique to this year. So I think as the Olympics sort of expands to include other non-traditional sports, there could be a way that not just like the endemic advertisers, like, P&G can also have more versatile messaging to reach different types of subcultures, but also bring in new brands like Vans that probably wouldn't have really had much involvement in the summer games had the Olympics, had skateboarding not become an Olympic sport.
Yeah, good point. So before we move on, if like coffee making people, if you're listening to this, I'm not saying it's not a hard job. Clearly, I drink instant coffee. It's too difficult for me.
It's too hard, for some people.
But I'm just saying, I don't think you can't compare anything to training for can you?
I was just going to say, based on my pandemic conditioning, that making coffee does constitute a workout for me right now.
Yeah, and some of those espresso, concoctions with the steamed milk and the little design on the milk, like that's some real artistry.
That's
and
fair.
I would think that I've never tried it, but I would think it would probably takes hours and hours of practice. So yeah, I think it's at least as rigorous, maybe more.
Olympic commitment. Yeah. All right. I always read, every time I get a coffee made and it's got one of those little like hearts on it or a little shape, I always read too much into it. I'm like, they did that just for me. I look around and everyone's got one. But anyway, in terms of future large-scale events, NBC Universal's sports calendar does include the Super Bowl, as we were talking about. This year coming up as well, February 2022. Apparently, 85% of ad slots were already sold or are in discussions, according to the company. That's in spite of the fact that Super Bowl 55 was seen by 96 million people, a 14-year low, according to Adweek. But as we mentioned at the top of the segment, it's still 96 million people. Try and find me a larger audience. All right, that's all we've got time for the story of the week. It's time now for the game of the week. But first, a quick word from our sponsor, VTEX. Retail's next competitive threat may come from a business model or channel that didn't even exist a few months ago. This modern dynamic requires companies to adapt quickly, pivoting business seemingly overnight, something traditional commerce platforms just can't support. There's a new enterprise commerce platform on the rise, one that's fast and flexible and doesn't require 9 months and $1 million to get up and running. Go to vtexvtex.com/eMarketer to learn more. Folks, we're back. It's time now for the game of the week. Today's game, what's the point? This is the part of the show where we read out 4 stories and have our contestants, Rahul, Blake, and Paul, tell us what they think is the main takeaway of the story. Okay answers get 1 point, good answers get 2, and you spoil me. Answers get 3 points. Each person gets 20 seconds to answer before they hear this. Whoever has the most points after 4 rounds wins and gets the last word. We'll start with Blake. When will time spent on digital equal linear? 2022. According to NBC Universal, the media giant thinks that time spent on its digital properties will equal its linear offerings like NBC, USA, and Bravo by the end of next year, just 18 months away. They say the current split is closer to 70-30 to linear. So Blake, when will time spent on digital equal linear? What's the point?
Well, the point is that that's good news for advertisers who are often looking for connected TV inventory, but struggle to find it. So the balancing out would be a welcoming thing for the industry. For NBC specifically, they've been starting to gain some traction with Peacock even before the Olympics. But I think some of the promising numbers that they're seeing, which will be reported, I think, in their third quarter earnings after the Olympics, will hopefully for them continue the trajectory. So it seems like they feel confident that they're really moving in that direction now.
Paul.
We've been using the term converged TV to refer to this confluence between linear TV and connected TV. And I think that's a good illustration of what's really going on, which is that people are simply watching their favorite shows and how they're delivered is becoming less and less important, at least to the end user. And I think this data reflects it. It's important that we note that we're talking about NBC on its own properties, not the overall ecosystem, but it's probably not that far off what's going on in general. So yeah, sign of the times.
Rahul.
I think the main takeaway for me was that NBCU is like prepping its ad buyers for this shift. We all knew this tipping point was coming, but their challenge is really to conserve or maintain as much of the revenue from traditional linear as they can while preparing for this shift to digital. And, those advertisers who've been hesitant to move into digital, I think they're really trying to lay the groundwork right now to be like, hey, this shift is coming. But really, it's like a self-serving kind of announcement, in my opinion, from that perspective.
And on that point, NBC made an announcement a little while back saying essentially that its ad rates for digital were going to be on par with its ad rates for linear, for prime time. And I think that did send a few kind of ripples of concern along the ad buying community. So yeah, I think you're right, Rahul. This could be a way to say, whether you guys like it or not, this is where the viewing is going. This is where our programming is going to be distributed. And your ads, that's where they need to be. And, that's why we want to charge as much as we're going to charge.
Yeah.
And also CPMs on connected TV in general are higher than on linear. So again, another way to kind of justify that asking for that premium.
Ms. Kahilane of Adweek said in June, NBC Universal completed its strongest upfront in its history, booking nearly $7 billion. 1.5 of that came from digital sales alone, Peacock accounting for 500 million of those digital commitments. In terms of the overall industry, not just NBC Universal, when will time spent on digital equal linear? Well, according to us, today's Americans spend about 3 hours and 15 minutes watching TV and 2.5 watching digital video. In 2 years, TV will fall 25 minutes, dropping to 2 hours and 50 minutes, 50. Video will add 13 minutes over that time to 2 hours and 40. So all told, TV, 2 hours and 50, video, 2 hours and 40. That's in 2 years' time. At that pace, time spent watching digital video could overtake TV in 2024 or 2025. Our forecast just goes to 2023, though.
Just one caveat about those figures is that we're comparing TV to all of digital video, which includes Google and Facebook and platforms that are really not the thrust of what NBC Universal is doing, which is specifically around connected TV. But I think the point still stands that, obviously more and more viewing is shifting to digital overall.
Yep. Story 2, let's move to our second round. We'll start with Paul, Google's new privacy timeline. Google just released a more in-depth timeline that will be updated monthly for its privacy initiatives, which of course includes getting rid of third-party cookies. Insider Intelligence analyst Nina Getson notes that now Google is saying it will phase out cookies over the course of 3 months in Q3 2023, following 9 months of monitoring adoption and taking feedback. Meanwhile, the company is of course busy preparing cookie alternatives. So Paul, Cookie's new privacy timeline, what's the point?
Well, this is just an illustration of the tension that Google and other big digital platforms face when it comes to just balancing, privacy with targeting capabilities, which is how they built their businesses. So now they're trying to respond to this popular outcry and concern about privacy. The proposals that they've put forth are interesting, but I think part of Nina's article talks about how the jury's still out as to whether marketers will accept them and whether they'll be effective at striking that balance.
Rahul.
Yeah, I think what my takeaway was, does anybody believe Google's timelines anymore? Is this like the second or third time maybe they've pushed out the deprecation of third-party cookies? And like Paul said, they've managed to make a bunch of different disparate parties upset over this too, which is not just marketers, but also privacy advocates and regulators are taking a closer look. So yeah, I think they opened a whole can of worms here, and now they're in damage control mode. I don't know. I am suspect about the idea that they won't push it out or change it again, but I guess that remains to be seen.
Blake.
Yeah, I think the reason why Marcus gets so frustrated when the story comes up is that it reminds him so much of Brexit, and he feels like he's having flashbacks to just the constant delays and moving of the goalposts with the timelines. And so I would say that I agree with Rahul that it seems like buying more time and it is a chance to sort of make as many involved parties as satisfied as possible. But the jury is still out on whether or not they're going to be able to satisfy any of the parties with this extended allotment of time.
Nina makes the point that, quote, open testing of Google's Flock and Fledge cookie alternatives next quarter will be crucial for their success or failure. Luckily, marketers now have just over 2 years to make other plans if things go awry, close quote, or as Rahul was pointing out, maybe longer. We move to our third round. We start with Rahul. Square buys Afterpay. Twitter co-founder Jack Dorsey's digital payments platform Square has agreed to take over the Australian buy now, pay later company Afterpay for $29 billion, notes the BBC. Afterpay is Australia's largest tech company by market cap. The company lets users pay for goods in 4 interest-free installments while getting the goods immediately. Most of Afterpay's revenue comes from merchants who pay a percentage of the value of each order placed by customers and a fixed fee as well. The service has over 16 million customers and is used by 100 million businesses around the world. Square and Afterpay expect the deal to close in Q1 2022. Rahul, Square buys Afterpay. What's the point?
Yeah, I'm so happy that you asked me this first, because the subject matter I'm least familiar with, I didn't even have a chance to crib ideas from my colleagues. I don't know, to be honest with you, what the takeaway is. I was unfamiliar with Afterpay. I really had to look up, how do these guys make money? And like you mentioned, it's very similar to like a card payment model where they're charging the merchant a fee. But they also charge the users if they're late with their payments. So it's like, seems like a new space. You know, my questions are always about, maybe my colleagues can speak to this, like what's the regulatory framework for this kind of thing, you know, in terms of how could that affect their future revenue if they're going to get hit by regulators in terms of how they operate their business models. And then also, you know, are we just in this phase where now these disruptors are just consolidating? Is that where we are in the payment sector? I'm not familiar enough with it to know that answer off the top of my head, but those are the two things that just popped into my head when I read this story.
So when Rahul talks about colleagues, he's talking about Blake and Paul, because he refers to me as his best friend. Blake.
As well he should.
Yeah, I think, look, I mean, I think it's no secret at this point that buy now, pay later is getting really popular, especially with Gen Z. And I think according to our forecast estimates, Klarna, it really has a pretty good hold on the market, but Afterpay is actually not too far behind. So in terms of an investment opportunity, it does seem like they are, like Square did make sort of a savvy move if they wanted to get into an emerging market by acquiring a company that's, you know, pretty close to, it's in second place, you know, by somewhat of a large margin, but it definitely has potential of, you know, becoming a top player in an emerging space. So I think it could, you know, have a pretty big payoff.
Paul.
I've always thought it was interesting how popular installment payment is in other parts of the world outside the US, Australia being one of the examples, and Klarna is a Swedish company. So I think this concept it just has a lot of traction and is very compelling. Ironically, in the US, we tend to use credit card debt, but I think this is kind of a different approach. And I agree also that it's a smart move by Square. So, you know, I think it's a concept that I could see even taking on more momentum than it has.
So, yeah, I mean, it wasn't an industry but 3 years ago, and now it's used by, I think, top of my head, 40 plus million people in the US, 45-ish million people in the US. So it's just exploded as an industry. Two other points I wanted to make. Apple just recently announced it's working on its own service called Apple Pay Later. So that could definitely be a disruptor here. And the second point, David Winning and Stuart Condy of the Wall Street Journal noted, quote, rising competition has led Afterpay to trial new products that it hopes will prevent merchants and customers from switching providers. In June, Afterpay introduced a loyalty program and said it would launch an Afterpay labeled bank account in October in partnership with Westpac Banking Corp. That's Australia's second largest bank, close quote. So they could have these buy now, pay later services. They could have the same problem as Uber and Lyft, getting people to stay loyal with one service. And so providing some kind of incentives for that seems to make a lot of sense. We move to our final round. Why marketers must start to think in 3D. We'll start with Blake. As marketers enter the metaverse, they must learn to think in 3D, writes Emily Liederman. She cites Kathy Hackle, Chief Metaverse Officer at research and consulting firm Futures Intelligence Group, who said, the way young people show up in the digital world is just as important as the physical world, which is troubling. To a young person, virtual skins can be just as important as real-world clothing, even if virtual Gucci products have been selling inside a video game Fortnite for more than the physical items. With Facebook discussing its transition from social media to the virtual world of the metaverse, Ms. Liederman notes that brands must prepare for a new set of challenges that do not exist in physical and 2D spaces. Blake, why marketers must start to think in 3D? What's the point?
So this is something that people were talking about a lot about a year ago. During sort of the height of the pandemic, a lot of summer events had been canceled. There are these huge different virtual events going on, like the Travis Scott Fortnite concert, the whole Fortnite renaissance with Nike and Gucci and Louis Vuitton having these skins. which led you to believe that this was the future. But I'm starting to think that might have been a little bit of an overestimation this summer, as I'm following just the swarms and swarms of young people who are going out to attend these live music festivals. I don't know if anybody saw the pictures of Lollapalooza last weekend. It leads me to believe that maybe we're not quite yet there where the world is going to be overtaken by virtual, and that in-person events should certainly not be something that should be forgotten by marketers in favor of these new 3D worlds.
Rahul.
Yeah, I do agree with Blake in the sense that a lot of this AR and VR metaverse type world stuff does seem overblown. Do marketers need to think about it? Yeah, I guess so. But the thing I would caution them about too is that, I feel like this idea of a metaverse advertisement is fodder for so many kind of like near future dystopian-ish or comedic shows. I was watching a show called Upload last night where a guy who's effectively in a virtual world couldn't escape a Taco Bell ad for like a Gordita Crunch or something like that. So it's like about user experience, it's like people are, these spaces are new. What's the user experience? Am I just going to really annoy a user with my, maybe like a ham-fisted attempt at marketing? So I think there's going to be a lot of testing and iteration from a marketer's perspective. And I would caution them to step into those waters gently if they can.
Paul.
Yeah, I mean, this whole conversation seems like a throwback to me to like the late 2000s when virtual worlds were like, a huge topic. In fact, we had dedicated coverage to virtual worlds. I don't even remember the names of a lot of them, but they pretty much all gone into the dustbin. Now, it could be that they were ahead of their time and that we are about to enter an era where this kind of marketing, 3D and VR and AR will kind of step to a new level. But I also agree that, to Blake's point, that we're now back in a much more physical world mentality, and we probably will be for some time. So I could see this kind of like lurking in the background for a while.
And that's it for the game of the week. This week's winner, drumroll, Rahul is this week's winner of the game of the week. Came in swinging.
I'm sure that has nothing to do with the fact that we're best friends.
Maybe. Perhaps. Rahul, you won this week's game of the week. Congratulations. That gives you the championship belt, which means nothing to no one. And also 30 seconds of airtime. What do you want to do with your last word?
Oh, me? I was supposed to say something.
Yes.
That's the part that, that's the part that nobody is ever prepared for.
This is my prize?
Yeah. Don't be too excited.
Oh, then I would heartily recommend this book I've been reading called Just Ride by a bike designer by the name of Grant Peterson, who has a cultish but nerdish following among bicyclists. His whole thing is riding bikes that bring you joy and happiness, and not necessarily ones that are designed to race around the Pyrenees or the Alps of France. So yeah, check out Grant Peterson, Just Ride, great book.
Very good. All right, that's what we've got time for the game of the week. It's time now for Questions Answered. This is the part of the show where we answer the questions that you've emailed into us. We have one this week from Blanca. Blanca is from the Netherlands, is who emailed in about luxury trends. Blanca, I'm so sorry if I'm butchering your name. So she said, "Dear Behind the Numbers crew, I'm a digital marketer for a luxury brand. So my question is related to this. What trends do you see in the luxury industry, particularly in fashion? How did the pandemic affect this sector? With luxury retail, the in-store experience was always very important for the purchasing decisions of consumers. Yet, COVID meant that more retailers needed to shift more and more to e-commerce. Do you have any data on how this played out in luxury? What omni-channel trends do you see?" And so we asked Blake, who is our resident retail expert, what he thought. So Blake, what have you got for Blanca?
So yeah, it's probably no surprise that luxury spending is down worldwide, and much of it is to do because of the pandemic. So the most recent data that we've seen from in the luxury market, since we don't produce any forecasts of our own yet in this particular space, but there's an interesting report from Wunderman Thompson Commerce called "Living in the Lap of Luxury," which was published in March 2021. So it's fairly recent data. And they found that 55% of luxury shoppers in the UK and the US said they're purchasing fewer luxury items as a consequence of COVID-19. And actually 53% of Chinese consumers are also reducing their spend. And obviously, if you're in the luxury space, you know that Chinese consumers are very much into luxury goods these days. So pretty much down across the board. And then on the flip side, only 10% of UK and US luxury shoppers said that they're spending more money on luxury items. And some of the top reasons that they found for this were that consumers are spending less because there are fewer events to attend. So, particularly for fashion, if there are less events, then less reasons to go out and buy new clothing. There are less opportunities to give gifts during the pandemics. And then another big one, obviously, is the inability to go into luxury stores. And then obviously the other side of this is that even though spending is down overall, online spending has gone up. And a lot of the things that we're seeing, at least in the US, being conducted by luxury brands and retailers that deal in luxury goods are leveraging social media for discovery. Social media has for a long time becoming sort of the digital replica of the shopping mall, and particularly on Instagram, where at least in the States, it's a place to discover fashion and luxury fashion as well. So certainly leveraging social media. And then within social media, obviously AR, the ability to try on and discover products is something that luxury goods companies are certainly dabbling in. It's not necessarily something that we're seeing is driving a large amount of conversions right now, but it's certainly something that's being experimented with. And then, of course, there's live stream shopping. So live stream shopping is very popular, has been very popular for fashion and fashion retailers in general. And then we've also seen retailers like Saks Fifth Avenue do a big live stream takeover on Instagram. Nordstrom has its own live streaming campaigns that they've conducted. And then there's also like personal live stream shopping, which is something that's very particular to luxury goods. I think a lot of the experience of going into a luxury store is getting that one-on-one help from the experts inside the store. So being able to sign up for an online session where it's not a one-to-many like a lot of the typical live stream shopping is, but a one-to-one is something that's actually very popular in this space, where you can have a live session inside of a retail store with someone helping you and showing you around. So those are some of the things that we've seen in the space. But I think in-store shopping in the luxury space is still really, really important. And I don't think that, all of the economy and everything aside, I think that in-store shopping is still going to be a large factor in sort of in the rebound in consumer spending on luxury goods.
Or you could just get a virtual Gucci bag.
Paul, at the start of that answer, were you taking a nap? At the very start of that answer, you tilted your head back. And I thought, oh, we've lost Paul. He's having a little sleep.
I'm sorry, were you speaking to me?
He looks as though Blake's got this one. I could take a few minutes.
Yeah, no, I was not.
Okay, all right.
My eyes are dry, so I was just trying to...
oh, okay, so you were... Relief. Okay, it was... I'm not losing my mind.
Every single word Blake said.
Okay. That's all right. Good answer, Blake. Very comprehensive indeed. With Blake, you get bang for your buck. So yeah, Blake, I hope that helps.
I'm not a luxury item. You get a lot of bang for your buck.
Blanca also said at the end of her email, P.S. Instant coffee is not real coffee, but I love the jokes. I'm kind of sad that my question will mean no joke of the week. So, I've never been pulled in two directions more in one sentence in my life. The sentence starts off horribly and then came to the perfect finish. She basically said, Marcus, your taste in coffee is abysmal, but you sure are funny.
But tell us a joke.
So I think, thank you, Blanca, but at the same time, how could you? If you've got any questions of your own, podcast@eMarketer.com, send them in if you just want to say hi. So we've got time for questions answered. It's time now for dinner party data. This is the part of the show where we tell you the most interesting thing we've learned this week. we start with Rahul because he is this week's winner of the Game of the Week. So, Rahul, what you got for us?
Yeah, I watched the first maybe 15 to 20 minutes of a documentary on WeWork and learned that Adam Neumann, the co-founder and former CEO, before the company seemed to have imploded, was actually raised in a kibbutz, which was very surprising to me because I think the pendulum swung pretty far from his upbringing to where he landed at WeWork. So I thought that was an interesting tidbit.
Huh. How was the rest of the doc?
I don't know. I only got through 15 minutes of it.
Okay.
To be honest with you, it was my wife's choice, and I think she lost interest in it. I was a little bit more immersed, but I had relinquished remote control to.
Okay.
To her
Well, you're a
hands.
docs guy, so I'm not surprised that you were like, let's do it.
Oh yeah, I'm definitely going to go back and finish it off.
Yeah,
I'll let you
in
know how the
secret,
rest of it
2
is
a.m.
next time.
Just quietly. She's like, what are you doing down there? Nothing? Very good. Blake, what you got for us, mate?
So yeah, since it's I think the last week of the Olympics, as at the time of this recording, I was looking up the gold medal count and the medal count. So right now, as of this recording, China has the most gold medals, while the U.S. has the most medals overall. And I got me interested in looking up sort of the all-time counts for Olympic medals. So I found that the U.S. has the most total Olympic medals with more than 2,800. And in second place is the United Kingdom, but a very distant second place at 883. And then after that is Germany, 855, France, 840, Italy, 701. So yeah, I think the U.S. has a pretty big lead over the rest of the countries.
I'm surprised that China and Russia aren't higher in that count.
So China is at 608. Russia is at 546, but I did wonder about that. And I was wondering if maybe, at least in the particular instance of Russia, if sort of after the fall of the Soviet Union, they kind of got set back to zero and they're just making up for ground, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, I was going to ask you how many countries on that list no longer exist. So maybe like the Soviet Union has X number and Russia has, some smaller number, but
There was a great article in the New York Times this week that was just about what is the actual value of a Olympic medal if you try to sell it. And the short answer is nobody really knows, but I guess context matters, like when was it awarded and who won it, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I'm sure like Michael Phelps' gold medal is probably worth more than like the guy who won, the cross country skiing in like the 80s.
Yeah, if Michael Phelps was a country, he'd be like 55th on that list of all time. Because it's insane. 28. That's a good one. Very good. Paul, what you got for us?
So going back to the Square buying Afterpay stat or item, here's an interesting stat about buy now, pay later overall business. This comes from Adobe, and I think it's US data. I'm not sure. They weren't clear about it, but that payment method rose by 215% year over year in the first 2 months of this year. So that gives you an indication of just how popular it is and how much momentum it has.
Wow. Yeah, it's remarkable. As I was saying before, it's just come out of nowhere. And like 3 years ago, you asked someone about it, and I think it was like 2 million people were using it in 2018. I think that's what we forecast. And now like tens of millions of people, and that continuing to climb. It's really interesting as well by age. I think it's something like around 30 to 40% of young people, but like very low single digits in terms of boomers. So there's a massive gap. And boomers, it doesn't seem like they're going to be climbing much at all. I think in the future, that's only going to get up to about 10%, where it just continues to ascend for young folks. So a big split by age as well with BNPL. Very good. 2 ones for you real quick. Number one, if you have a plan B, your plan A is less likely to work, apparently. In a series of experiments from the University of Pennsylvania in 2016, researchers found that when volunteers came up with a backup plan before starting a task, they did worse at the task than those who hadn't thought of a plan B. That's because when they realized they had options, their motivation for succeeding the first time dropped. Second one I got for you. Fidgeting could offset the health hazards of prolonged sitting. You might think that fidgeting is an annoying habit that you need to control. Well, you do. I'm kidding. No, you don't. It turns out that the mindless movements are good for your health, especially if you have to sit for long spans. Research published by the American Physiological Society in 2016 showed that when people moved their leg every few minutes, it increased the arterial blood flow in the limb. However, when they stayed still, blood flow decreased. So it got me thinking about breaks and how often we should take them. Productivity experts haven't yet reached a consensus, but it's somewhere between 50 to 90 minutes, 50 to 90 minutes. The US Army Research Institute found ultradian rhythms have 90-minute cycles. So you could take a break every 90 minutes, or should take a break every 90 minutes. If 90 minutes is too long, try a break every 50 minutes. The Atlantic thinks you can reach perfect productivity by working for 52 minutes and then taking a break for 17.
Did it say anything about taking naps during podcasts?
It said, do them regularly.
It's a productivity hack that people haven't caught on yet, Paul.
I'm ahead of my time.
That is all we have time for this episode. Thank you so much to my guests. Thank you to Blake.
Thank you.
Thank you to Paul.
Always a pleasure.
Despite sleeping through half the show. And thank you to Rahul, the winner of this week's Game of the Week.
Thanks, my BFF.
Thanks to Victoria. She edits the show. Thanks to everyone listening. For questions or to just say hi, you can email us at podcast@eMarketer.com. In August, we are rolling out a few episodes of our Industry Voices videos that previously streamed in case you missed them. This Monday, August 9th, features a great conversation with Alessio Rossi, Executive VP and Head of Digital Transformation at Shiseido. We'll see you guys on Monday for the Behind the Numbers Daily, an eMarketer podcast made possible by VTEX. Have good weekends.
Victoria, what percentage of your job is trying to figure out which pronunciation of names to go with that Marcus will just throw two at and just leave in the dust?
It happens a lot. Part of it's just the spelling, but part of it's also just my accent. I just said bloody nightmare. I don't know why I bother living in the US. My days are
it's okay. It's okay to not be a native speaker, Marcus. I mean,
I'd also love for you now, just hearing a taste of your American accent, for you to just try to do an entire podcast in your version of an American accent.
That'd be hilarious.
Every
to me. I just want it to be like some SoCal surfer bro, like that's like the safe space that you were
my
treated
accent.
to.
It always goes to California. It's like, oh my God, like, oh my God.